Hey everyone, TruthSurge here again. I'd like to start this video off with a question directed primarily towards my Christian friends. What would you think if I told you that most of the events in the life of Jesus were simply copied from Old Testament stories? Well, this is exactly what I want to show you in this video. I'm going to look at several examples of this, and we'll examine those in some amount of detail. But before we do that, I think it's a good idea if we talk about the criteria that we might use to determine if copying really happened or not. There's a few criteria we might want to look at. The first one would be accessibility. Did the author have access to the original story? The second criteria might be density. How many details of the original story are showing up in the copy? And the third criteria we might want to examine would be chronology, and we might call it order, sequence. Of those details that are similar, are they in the same order? That would give you a real strong indication there that copying was occurring. And the last criteria that we would want to examine would be verbal distinctiveness. If there were some interesting turns of phrases or unique words, things like that, that were pulled over into the copy, verbatim sections that show up in the copy, anything like that is going to give us a good feeling that copying went on. So this is what we're going to look at in this video. And so without further hesitation, let's go ahead and look at some of these examples. The first case of copying I'd like to examine is the miracle of Jesus calming the sea. It's found in Mark 4:35 through 39. Let me just read it, then we can look at an Old Testament story that bears a striking resemblance. That day when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was, in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Then the wind died down, and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." Now let's look at another familiar tale from the Old Testament and see if you can spot some of the similarities right off the bat. Jonah 1:4 through 6, plus verses 15 and 16. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He went down to Joppa, where he found a ship bound for that port. After paying the fare, he went aboard and sailed for Tarshish to flee from the Lord. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, and we will not perish." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this, the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. You may have noticed several similarities between the two stories just upon one reading. Now let's talk a little bit about these two accounts. Did Mark have access to the Old Testament? The Hebrew Old Testament was written hundreds of years before Mark wrote his Gospel, and the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, would have been completed sometime in the 2nd century BC. a couple of hundred years before Mark wrote his Gospel. So the author had access to both the Hebrew and Greek translations of the Old Testament. The second criteria, density. How many details line up between the two accounts? Let's look at this in a little bit more detail. Now let's compare each detail side by side and see how many details actually match. Jesus was in a boat. Jonah was in a boat. A crew of several men were with Jesus. A crew of several men were with Jonah. A furious squall arose. A great wind arose. A fierce storm came upon them. A fierce storm came upon them. The storm was so intense that it threatened to capsize the boat. The storm was so intense that it threatened to destroy the boat. Jesus was asleep while the storm was raging. Jonah was asleep while the storm was raging. The disciples were afraid. The crew was afraid. The disciples woke Jesus for help. The captain woke Jonah for help. The disciples were indignant about Jesus' apparent lack of concern. The captain was indignant about Jonah's apparent lack of concern. The sea grew miraculously calm after Jesus spoke to it. The sea grew miraculously calm after Jonah was thrown into it. Once the sea had grown calm, the disciples grew terrified. Once the sea had grown calm, the crew members grew terrified. We can see not only a few, but 11 details that match between the two accounts. Now we can also see that criteria number 3, the chronology or the ordering of the events, matches perfectly. Every last detail lines up in the same order between the two accounts. Now, criteria number 4 was verbal distinctiveness. Is there anything between the two accounts that would lead us to believe that Mark copied the Jonah account? Well, if we look at the third detail that matched, a great wind arose in Jonah, and a furious squall arose in Mark. This counts as verbal distinctiveness, because it's not something you would usually find in the New Testament. So, between these two accounts, all 4 criteria were met, and were met thoroughly. There can be no doubt that Mark copied the Jonah story and used it to create the miracle of Jesus calming the sea. An interesting note regarding Mark's copying of the Jonah account: the Sea of Galilee is not really a sea, it's a lake, and it's only a few miles across, and it's also nestled inside of a valley. There is no way that the wind could blow hard enough to blow up waves large enough to threaten to capsize a boat capable of holding Jesus and 12 other men. Let's look at another example, a very familiar miracle, the feeding of the 5,000. We can find this story in Matthew 14, verses 15 through 21. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. Now, let's go see if we can find the original story from where Matthew got these details. Let's look at 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 42 through 44. A man came from Baal-Shalisha, bringing the man of God 20 loaves of barley bread baked from the first ripe grain, along with some heads of new grain. "Give it to the people to eat," Elisha said. "How can I set this before 100 men?" his servant asked. But Elisha answered, "Give it to the people to eat, for this is what the Lord says, they will eat and have some left over." Then he set it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of the Lord. Now, these two accounts seem suspiciously similar, but let's see if we can apply the criteria that we talked about earlier and see how they stack up. Well, obviously Matthew had a copy of the Septuagint Old Testament in his lap, so that's a foregone conclusion. When Matthew quotes from the Old Testament, his wording lines up exactly with the Septuagint version rather than the Hebrew version of the Old Testament. So Matthew not only had access to the Old Testament, he was actually using the Greek translation of the Old Testament. He had access to the previous story. Criteria number 2, density. How many details are present from the earlier story in the copy? Let's just examine those. A large group of people were gathered in a remote place. The people were without food. In Matthew, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish were used as food. In 2 Kings, 20 loaves of bread were used as food. Jesus told one of his disciples to feed the group. Elisha told his servant to feed the group. Jesus' disciple protested about the number of people compared to the amount of food. Elisha's servant protested about the number of people compared to the amount of food. In Matthew, the people all received some food and were filled. In 2 Kings, the people all received some food and were filled. After the meal, there was some food left over. An interesting point here is that Jesus' miracle was much more impressive because he fed many more people than Elisha did, but with less food. Elisha only fed 120 people with 20 loaves of bread, whereas Jesus fed 5,000 with only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. The density number here is 7. 7 details from the original story are present in Matthew's copy. Also, all of the details are sequential. They are in the same order. In this case, criteria number 4 is not met. There is nothing particularly distinctive about the grammar that Matthew uses. But it is interesting to note that in both accounts, the prophet is commanding someone else to feed the group. Why would Jesus not just give the bread to the group after he blessed it? He gives it back to his disciples to feed the group. This is a clear indication of Matthew trying to adhere to the previous story. We can see now with a little bit more clarity that Matthew has definitely copied the Elisha feeding of the 120 and upped the ante to make Jesus feed more people in his feeding of the 5,000. Now, we've looked at 2 examples. I want to give you another example you can try on your own. The story of Jesus raising the widow's son from the dead. If you'll look in Luke chapter 7, verses 11 through 16, then go compare that with 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 7 through 24, and just go through the same motions that I've shown you on these first 2 examples. Write down the similarities between the 2 accounts. Number them. See if they're sequential. See if there's any special phrases that may have been brought over from the original story. Now let me leave you with another tidbit before I go. In Mark, Jesus' last words were supposedly, my God, why have you forsaken me?" That's found in Mark 15, verse 34. But if we roll back time a little bit and look in Psalms, if we go to the 22nd chapter, we see something very interesting. Verse 1, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Let's try this again with Jesus' last words in Luke. Luke chapter 23, verse 46. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. We need only look a few chapters ahead in Psalms to find the original statement. Psalms 31, verse 5. Into your hand I commit my spirit. There are tons of other examples of copying from the Old Testament to invent the life of Jesus. If you have time, see if you can find some of these on your own. Look especially at the crucifixion of Jesus. Most of the details surrounding his crucifixion can be found in Psalms 22 and Isaiah 53.